Good evening, my friend. I am Professor Salamander, and tonight I invite you to walk with me to the moment when a quiet world began to change. There are nights at Hogwarts when a single cry in the darkness, a forgotten track in the earth, or a secret hidden beneath ancient roots can set events in motion that cannot be undone. The forest is waiting, the moon is watching, and some mysteries refuse to remain buried. Come closer, and let us begin. There were nights at Hogwarts when the castle seemed less like a school and more like some ancient living thing that had decided, for reasons of its own, to allow witches and wizards to dwell for a little while within its stone ribs, under its watchful towers, beside its murmuring staircases and sleeping halls. And on such nights, when the wind moved softly over the black lake and the moon poured silver upon the grounds, Rubeus Hagrid often felt that he understood the place better than almost anyone alive. He was returning late to his hut after seeing off a nervous pair of third years who had helped him feed the hippogriffs before dusk, and though they had tried hard not to show it, both had hurried away toward the castle once the last of the light had gone from the sky, casting fearful looks toward the edge of the forbidden forest, where the dark trees stood packed together like giants whispering in confidence. Hagrid, however, paused at his door instead of going in, and with one hand resting on Fang's broad head, he frowned toward that same line of trees. Something was wrong. He could not yet have said what it was, and that annoyed him, because his understanding of creatures had never come through books or tidy explanations, but through instinct, long practice, and the sort of patience that came from spending years among beings whom most wizards judged far too quickly. The grounds looked peaceful enough. The pumpkins in his patch sat great and round beneath the moonlight. A faint glow shone from several castle windows. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called once. Then again, and nearer at hand, the rustling grass bent in the breeze like water. Yet beneath all that lay a curious absence, subtle but unmistakable. Fang whined low in his throat. "Yeah," Hagrid muttered, squinting towards the forest. "You feel it and all, do ya?" The boarhound pressed close to his leg, which was unlike him when there was only darkness to be afraid of, for Fang was usually frightened by shadows, breezes, and his own imagination equally. But this was different. This was not the ordinary fearfulness of a soft-hearted hound. It was the unease of an animal who knew that some proper order had shifted. Hagrid stood very still. Ordinarily, at that hour, he would have heard signs of life from the forest's edge if he took the trouble to listen carefully enough. The far crack of a branch under the weight of something large, the flutter and settle of hidden wings, the soft tread of creatures coming to drink. Sometimes, if the night was right and the breeze carried sound cleanly, the faint rattling exhalation of thestrals from the paddock deeper in among the trees. But tonight the forest sounded oddly thin, as though a piece of it had been cut away. He tightened his grip on the crossbow slung over his back, though he disliked using it except in the most necessary circumstances, and gave a little grunt. "Come on then," he said. Fang resisted at once, digging his paws into the earth. "Oh, don't start that now. We're only taking a look." This, Hagrid knew perfectly well, was untrue. There was no such thing as only taking a look when the Forbidden Forest had gone quiet in the wrong way. Still, one did not say that aloud to a dog already reconsidering every choice he had ever made. Hagrid lit the tip of his umbrella with a murmured spell, not enough to blaze like a torch, but enough to throw a dim amber light about their path. And together they crossed the patch of ground behind the hut and approached the trees. The air changed almost at once beneath the first branches. Outside, the spring night had been cool and open. Inside, It was close with moss and bark and old damp leaves, rich with the smell of earth that had held centuries of secrets and would likely keep them still. He moved forward slowly, ducking beneath low branches, stepping over roots as thick as a man's waist. Fang came on reluctantly behind him, panting too loudly. Hagrid listened as he walked, and the farther in they went, the surer he became that his instincts had not betrayed him. The silence here was not natural. It was not complete, of course, for no wood was ever truly silent, but the sounds that remained were scattered and wrong, like a tune with half its notes missing. At last he reached a narrow clearing where he stopped so abruptly that Fang bumped into the back of his boots. The ground had been disturbed. Hagrid crouched, bringing the amber glow lower, and his heavy brows drew together at once. There were marks in the mud, many of them, but not the sort one expected from centaurs or acromantulas, or even wandering students foolish enough to test the boundaries of school rules. Some were boot prints, deep and hurried, from at least 3 people by the look of them. Others were drag marks. And near the roots of a leaning beech tree, there glimmered a length of fine silver mesh. Hagrid picked it up with 2 thick fingers. "Netting," he murmured. It was light, but magically strengthened, woven with threads that flashed faintly in his umbrella light. Not common rope work, not something for poachers after ordinary game. This had been made for magical creatures, and not by amateurs either. Fang let out a frightened bark. "Quiet," Hagrid whispered sharply, rising to his feet. He had heard it too. From deeper in the wood there came a sound so faint that another man might have mistaken it for the movement of leaves. Hagrid did not. It was the weak, strained cry of some creature in distress. He started forward at once, moving far more quickly now, one arm shielding his face from branches, the other holding the umbrella out before him. Twice he nearly slipped on the wet ground. Once he snapped a dead limb clean underfoot, and ahead the cry came again, thinner than before, carrying terror in it now. Then the trees broke around him into a wider glade, and the sight there made his whole body go rigid. A young thestral lay tangled against a fallen log, one wing twisted in silver mesh, its black, skeletal body heaving as it fought to rise. Even wounded and half-trapped, it was difficult to look at directly, with its bat-like wings, its dragonish face, and its pale eyes shining through the dark. Hagrid saw it clearly, of course, as did anyone who had witnessed death, and his heart clenched at once, for he recognized the creature. It was one of the younger ones from the Hogwarts herd, not yet fully grown, still lean with youth. "Easy now," he said at once, dropping to one knee. "Easy, easy, I'm here." Lo, the thestral jerked against the net, trembling, and Hagrid could see raw skin at the edge of one foreleg where the enchanted mesh had bitten as the creature struggled. He set aside the umbrella, pulled a knife from his belt, and carefully began slicing through the silver strands. "Who'd do this to ye, eh?" he muttered, voice low and soothing. "Nasty bit of work. Hold still now." The creature tossed its head, but whether it knew him or merely sensed that he was trying to help, it stopped thrashing quite so violently. Hagrid worked as fast as he could, though his great hands, gentle as they were not made for fine cutting. At last the final cords gave way, and the thestral lurched upright with a shudder that ran through its whole narrow frame. It did not flee. Instead, it stood swaying beside him, breathing hard. Hagrid laid one hand lightly against its neck. And that was when he noticed the collar. Not a Hogwarts harness, not anything he had ever used. This was a thin leather strap fastened tightly beneath the creature's jaw, and hanging from it was a brass tag stamped with a tiny symbol he did not know, a circle crossed by 3 straight lines. Hagrid stared. "No," he said very softly. Someone had not merely tried to catch the Thestral. Someone had nearly succeeded. He removed the collar at once and turned it over in his palm. There was magic in it. He could feel that much, though the purpose was unclear. Tracking, perhaps. Restraint. Transport. None of the possibilities improved his temper. The Thestral gave a soft clicking sound and nudged once at his shoulder, then spread its wings carefully, testing the injured one. It was hurt, but not too badly to fly. "Back to the paddock with you," Hagrid said, "and stay there if you've any sense." The creature sprang forward and vanished almost at once into the darkness between the trees, more shadow than flesh. Hagrid watched it go, then looked down again at the ruined net, the drag marks, and the collar in his hand. This had not been random. This had not been some fool blundering into the forest after a rare sighting and getting in over his head. The net had been prepared. The collar had been made in advance. The poachers, if that was what they were, had known exactly what they wanted. A cold anger rose through him, steady and heavy. No one came into Hogwarts grounds to steal its creatures. No one set traps in the forest and walked away thinking they would never be found out. Not while he still drew breath. Behind him, somewhere between the trees, came the sudden sound of hooves. Not one set. Several. Hagrid turned. Shapes were moving through the wood, swift and silent, circling toward the glade, and though he could not yet make out their faces, he knew at once from the rhythm of their approach that the centaurs had found the disturbance too. He closed one great fist around the brass tag and lifted his umbrella. "Right," he said into the darkness, his voice losing every trace of softness. "Let's see what else has been taken." The centaurs emerged from the trees with the grave swiftness of beings who belonged to the forest more completely than the roots and branches themselves, and in the dimness of that moon-streaked glade, their powerful flanks and shadowed human torsos seemed fashioned out of bark, night, and old bronze, so that for one uncertain instant they looked less like living creatures than like ancient judgments stepping out from the hidden places of the wood. Hagrid did not raise his crossbow, for he knew well enough that such a gesture would be foolish, insulting, and entirely unnecessary. Yet he tightened his grip on the broken collar in one hand and on his umbrella in the other, because though he counted several among the centaurs as uneasy allies, he also knew that they did not take kindly to disturbance within their realm and were not in the habit of offering trust before it had been earned. Firenze was among them, his pale hair catching what little light filtered through the leaves, and beside him stood 2 others Hagrid recognized by sight, if not by easy friendship, one broad-chested and dark-eyed, the other stern enough in his expression to make the old oaks seem mild-tempered by comparison, and for a moment none of them spoke, which in itself was answer enough to tell Hagrid that they had sensed something deeply wrong before ever reaching the clearing. Then Firenze stepped forward and lowered his gaze to the slashed silver mesh at Hagrid's feet, to the torn mud, and finally to the brass tag in Hagrid's hand, and his face, always composed in that strange, distant way of his people, hardened into something colder. "Men have entered the forest with purpose," he said, and though his tone remained quiet, it carried through the glade like the edge of a blade moving free from its sheath. "Not wandering boys, not frightened villagers, not ministry officials on inspection, but hunters." "Aye," Hagrid replied, his voice roughening with anger the more plainly the truth was named. "One of the young Thestrals was trapped here not a minute ago, and there were at least 3 of them, maybe more, boots in the mud, drag marks, enchanted netting, all planned out proper. And if this is what they left behind in their hurry, then I don't much like to think what they managed to carry off." At those words, the dark-eyed centaur bent, touched the earth with his fingers, and brought them back up smeared with wet black soil, studying the impressions in silence before he straightened again, his nostrils flaring as though even now the scent of foreign magic offended him. "They came twice," he said. Hagrid frowned. "Twice?" The centaur pointed toward the northern edge of the glade, where a half-broken fern lay pressed flat beneath the bracken, and then toward a narrower trail that disappeared between two ash trees. "One party entered before moonrise and laid the snare," he said. "Another returned later with cages." Hagrid felt the anger in him settle from a hot flare into something much worse, because fury, though dangerous, was at least simple, whereas this was method, patience, planning, and he knew enough about wizards who traded in rare magical creatures to understand what such care implied. Nobody risked entering the Forbidden Forest under cover of darkness unless the prize was worth enough gold to justify the danger, and nobody came with enchanted restraints unless they expected to take beasts alive. Fang, who had crept close behind Hagrid's boots and would have preferred the entire matter to cease at once and relocate somewhere nearer a warm fire, gave another small whine, while above them the branches stirred with a sudden restless murmuring, as if the trees themselves objected to what had passed beneath them. "Have any of you seen more sign?" Hagrid asked, turning from one centaur to the next. "Any missing unicorn foals? Wounded creatures? Tracks leading deeper in?" Firenze did not answer immediately, and in that brief pause, Hagrid knew that the reply would not be one he wished to hear. "At the western stream," Firenze said at last, "there was blood on the stones where none should have been, and near the old U circle there were splinters from a broken crate marked with a warding spell meant for transport, not for protection. And farther north, the bowtruckles fled from 3 of their trees and would not return, though dawn was still far away. And all this together means what you already suspect." Hagrid exhaled once through his nose, long and hard. "They've been harvesting the forest." The stern centaur at Firenze's side made a sound almost like contempt. "Harvesting," he repeated. "That is the word men use when they wish to steal from living things and pretend they are merely gathering what the world offered freely." Hagrid would not have argued with that, not tonight, so he merely crouched again in the churned mud and held the brass tag nearer the faint light from his umbrella. The little symbol upon it, a circle crossed by 3 straight lines, glinted with a dull yellow sheen, and as he turned it in his palm, he noticed, on the reverse side, 3 nearly invisible letters stamped so finely that he had missed them before beneath the grime. CLV. He rubbed the metal with his thumb. "Know this mark?" he asked. Firenze leaned closer, but he shook his head. "Not from the stars, and not from our dealings with the Ministry." "Nor mine," said the dark-eyed centaur, though he looked at the collar with naked dislike. "But the magic on it is foul in its purpose, because it bends a creature's will toward stillness and confuses its sense of direction, so that it may be led away from its home while believing it walks of its own choosing." Hagrid's great hand closed so hard around the collar that the leather creaked. "That's filth," he growled. "That's what that is." A picture had begun forming in his mind now, ugly and increasingly clear, and it was a picture of frightened creatures lured or trapped, collared, caged, and then smuggled off the grounds by people who believed magical beasts were trinkets for collectors, ingredients for illegal potions, or trophies to be hidden in private menageries by rich fools who mistook possession for admiration. He had seen lesser versions of such wickedness before in distant rumors, and half-whispered ministry reports, but never this close to Hogwarts, never this bold, and never with signs of inside knowledge, because that troubled him most of all. The poachers had known where to set the trap. They had known which route patrols least often used. They had known, perhaps, even the habits of the thestral herd. Someone had informed them. Fang barked suddenly into the darkness behind them. Every centaur turned in the same instant. There came from deeper in the wood a sharp cracking sound, then another. Then the unmistakable rush of something large forcing its way through undergrowth at speed, and Hagrid sprang upright just as a shape burst through the line of hazel and bramble at the far edge of the clearing. For a heartbeat, his hand flew toward the crossbow, and then he saw what it was. A unicorn foal. It stumbled rather than ran, its silver coat streaked with mud, its flanks heaving, and though its little horn was only a pale spiral bud and not yet grown to full elegance, there was enough wild grace in it even now to make the sight of its terror intolerable. A length of snapped chain dragged from one hind leg, clattering against roots as it lurched forward in blind panic, while around its neck, gleaming like mockery in the moonlight, hung another leather collar marked with the same brass tag. The foal nearly slid in the mud before Hagrid caught it. "Steady, steady there," he said at once, though the creature trembled so violently he feared it might break something in its own struggle. "Nobody's taken you now." The unicorn's dark eyes rolled white at the edges, and Hagrid felt with a sick certainty that it had been confined recently, perhaps only minutes before, because there was the smell of strange wood on it, the kind used in magically reinforced crates, and a faint bitterness in the air about its coat that reminded him of sedative drafts brewed for dangerous transport. "It escaped," Firenze said. "Aye, and not far from where it was meant to be loaded, I'll wager," Hagrid replied, lowering himself carefully so that his bulk did not frighten the foal further. "Which means they're near, or they were near enough." The chain attached to the leg ended in a broken iron clasp, and Hagrid did not like iron near unicorns any better than he liked the collar near their throats. So with a muttered charm and one powerful twist, he snapped it free and cast it aside. The foal shivered, pressed for one desperate moment into his coat as if any living warmth would do, and then sprang away to stand close behind Firenze, who inclined his head slightly as though acknowledging a guest too frightened for ceremony. For a few breaths, nobody spoke. Then Hagrid said very slowly, because the shape of the truth had now become too obvious to ignore, "This weren't just about thestrals." "No," said Firenze. Hagrid looked from the terrified foal to the collar in his hand, then to the silver mesh on the ground, and finally to the trampled trail leading northward into the deeper forest, where the trees grew older, darker, and more tangled around places even students never glimpsed. If the poachers had first gone after the thestrals and then managed to seize a unicorn foal, then they were not opportunists choosing what chance presented. They were collecting, selecting, taking only creatures rare enough and valuable enough to justify a carefully built operation. And if they had entered with crates, then those crates might not yet be empty. "We've got to move," Hagrid said, his voice suddenly like stone rolling downhill. "Not wait till morning, not send an owl first, not stand about wondering what some ministry office will say once it's too late. If they've got more creatures penned somewhere in these woods, every minute matters." The stern centaur's expression darkened. "The forest is not yours to command." "No," Hagrid said, meeting his gaze without flinching, "but the creatures in danger tonight aren't yours to lose either." That hung between them for a long moment, hard and sharp, until at last Firenze stepped forward again, and though his face was solemn, there was agreement in it. "The stars did not speak plainly of this," he said, "but the earth has spoken enough. We will track the intruders to the northern hollow. That is where the trail is strongest." Hagrid nodded once. Then, from far off through the trees, there came a thin, echoing cry unlike any ordinary call of the forest, and even before it faded, Hagrid knew with dreadful certainty that it was the sound of another captured creature. He turned toward the north, where the shadows lay thickest beneath the ancient pines, and every line of his enormous frame seemed to gather into purpose. "Then let's be faster than they expect," he said, and together, beneath a moon now half hidden by cloud, they plunged deeper into the forbidden dark. The deeper reaches of the forbidden forest were not merely darker in the ordinary sense of shadow and absence of light, but rather possessed a thickness to the gloom that seemed to press inward from all sides, as though the trees themselves had grown so ancient and so closely bound together that they no longer allowed the night to pass cleanly between them. And as Hagrid advanced beside the centaurs along the narrowing trail, he felt the air grow colder and more watchful, as though every step carried them farther from the known edges of Hogwarts and closer to a place where the rules of the outside world held less authority. Fang did not like it at all, which he made known through a constant low whimper that vibrated uneasily in his throat. Yet he followed nonetheless, because his loyalty, though timid, was stronger than his fear, and Hagrid spared him a brief glance of approval before fixing his attention once more upon the path ahead, where the centaurs moved with an effortless certainty that made no sound beyond the faintest whisper of hooves upon damp earth. The signs of intrusion grew clearer with every yard they covered, and though Hagrid had expected to find tracks, broken branches, and the occasional discarded tool, he had not expected such carelessness in the wake of what must have been, at least in part, a carefully planned operation. For here and there lay fragments of the same silver mesh he had cut from the thestral, snagged upon thorns or half buried in the mud, and once he found the imprint of a crate corner pressed deep into the soil, its edges marked with a faint residue of spellwork that shimmered just enough to betray its presence to one who knew how to look. "They were in a hurry leavin'," Hagrid muttered, crouching beside the mark, and though he spoke softly, the words seemed to carry strangely in that enclosed darkness, as though the forest itself listened and remembered. "Something spooked them." "Or something pursued them," said Firenze, who had paused just ahead, his gaze fixed upon a patch of disturbed undergrowth where the leaves had been flattened not by human boots, but by the frantic passage of something much lighter and far more desperate. Hagrid rose again, his brow furrowing. "The unicorn foal," he said. "Must have bolted, made enough noise to set everything off." "That would not explain the broken formation of their trail," replied the dark-eyed centaur, gesturing toward the branching tracks that now veered unevenly between the trees. They did not retreat in order. They scattered, regrouped, and then moved again with urgency. Hagrid followed the line of those marks, and as he did so, a thought, unwelcome and persistent, began to take shape in his mind. For though fear could cause men to flee without discipline, it rarely caused them to abandon valuable cargo unless something greater than their original purpose had forced their hand. "What if they weren't just spooked by noise?" he said slowly. "What if something else in the forest went after them?" At that, the stern centaur gave a short, humorless exhale. "There are many in these woods who would not tolerate such intrusion," he said. "Yet none would pursue so recklessly as to leave the ground marked in this fashion, for even the acromantulas hunt with a patience that preserves the secrecy of their domain. Unless," Firenze added quietly, "they believed the threat greater than the trespass, Hagrid did not like that at all. They pressed on. The trail sloped gradually downward, and the earth beneath their feet grew softer, richer, threaded with the roots of older trees whose trunks twisted skyward in shapes that suggested long memory and deeper silence. And after some time, though it might have been minutes or might have been far longer, for the forest had a way of stretching time, until it no longer followed any familiar measure, they came upon a narrow hollow, where the ground dipped sharply between two ridges thick with bracken. There, at last, the full shape of the poacher's operation revealed itself. 3 crates stood in the hollow, each constructed from heavy timber reinforced with bands of dark metal that pulsed faintly with magic. And though 2 of them stood closed and locked, the third had been forced open from within, its door hanging crookedly on one hinge, while splintered wood lay scattered across the ground like the remnants of a struggle too fierce for containment. Hagrid moved toward them at once, his heart pounding heavily in his chest, and as he approached, he could hear it, the faint, muffled movement from within one of the sealed crates, accompanied by a low, distressed sound that set his teeth on edge. "Alive," he said, and there was both relief and urgency in the word. "They've got something alive in there still." Without waiting for further agreement, he seized the iron latch of the nearest crate and pulled, but the mechanism did not yield, for it had been sealed with a locking charm layered beneath the physical fastening. And though Hagrid was not without magical ability, such spells were not easily undone by force alone. "Stand back," Firenze said. One of the other centaurs stepped forward, raised a hand, and spoke a word in a language Hagrid did not know, a sharp, cutting sound that seemed less spoken than released, and at once the faint glow along the crate's edges flickered and broke, as though the magic binding it had been sliced through by something unseen. Hagrid wasted no time. With a single wrench of his arm, he tore the latch free and flung the door open. Inside, pressed against the far wall, its great golden eyes wide with fear, crouched a creature Hagrid had not expected to see. A young Graphorn. Its stony hide bore fresh scratches, and its curved horns had chipped the interior wood in its attempts to escape, while a heavy collar identical in design to the others encircled its thick neck, glowing faintly as it struggled not to move, as though the enchantment upon it compelled stillness even in the presence of terror. Hagrid felt something inside him harden. "Bloody fools," he growled, stepping forward slowly so as not to startle it further. "Do you even know what you've taken, eh? Dragging a Graphorn calf out of its territory like this, thinking it won't have consequences." The creature shifted, muscles bunching beneath its armored skin, yet it did not charge, for the collar's magic held it in a state of confused restraint, its instincts dulled just enough to prevent the full force of its nature from breaking loose. Hagrid reached up, fingers already moving toward the fastening. "Easy now," he murmured. "We'll have that off you in a tick." But as his hand closed upon the collar, a sudden crack of sound split the air above them, sharp and unmistakable, followed at once by a streak of red light that slammed into the ground not 3 feet from where he stood, sending dirt and splinters flying in all directions. "Back!" shouted one of the centaurs. Hagrid turned, already pulling his umbrella free, and through the trees at the edge of the hollow he saw them. 3 figures in dark cloaks, wands raised, their faces obscured by shadow, but their intent clear in the stance of their bodies, and the spells already gathering at their fingertips. "Well now," Hagrid said, his voice dropping into something low and dangerous as he stepped between the attackers and the trapped creatures. "Looks like we found our hunters after all." Another jet of light burst from the trees, and the forest, which had held its breath until now, seemed at last to awaken around them. The spell that tore through the hollow did not merely strike the ground with the blunt force of careless aggression, but rather split the damp earth apart with a crackling violence that spoke of practiced intent, so that clods of soil leapt into the air like startled creatures, and the shattered remains of the broken crate scattered farther into the undergrowth, while the echo of the impact rolled outward through the trees, as though the forest itself had been struck and forced to acknowledge the intrusion it had thus far endured in silence. Hagrid did not retreat, though every instinct born of long experience told him that he now stood between something ruthless and something defenseless, and so instead of stepping back, he planted his boots more firmly in the churned mud and lifted his umbrella as though it were a wand forged for war rather than concealment, while behind him the young Graphorn let out a low, grinding rumble that vibrated through the hollow like distant thunder, its confusion giving way inch by inch to anger that even the collar's enchantment could not entirely suppress. "Drop your wands," Hagrid said, and though his voice did not rise, it carried a weight that made even Fang's whining cease for a heartbeat, because it was the tone of a man who had already decided that whatever came next would not end in compromise. "This ends here." The cloaked figures did not obey, which did not surprise him in the least, for those who trespassed into the forbidden forest with cages and collars were not the sort inclined toward surrender once discovered, and instead one of them stepped forward just enough for the dim light to catch the edge of a mask that concealed the upper half of his face, a simple thing of dark metal that bore no insignia but seemed designed to erase identity rather than declare allegiance. "You are interfering in ministry-sanctioned work," the masked wizard said, his voice distorted by a charm that rendered it both deeper and strangely hollow, as though it echoed inside a chamber too small to contain it. "Step aside, gamekeeper, and no harm will come to you." Hagrid let out a sound that might have been a laugh if it had contained any humor at all, which it did not, for the idea that such actions could bear the mark of official approval struck him not merely as false, but as insulting in its audacity. "Ministry-sanctioned?" he repeated, and now there was iron in his tone. "You think I don't know the difference between proper creature transport and poachin', between regulation and greed dressed up in fine words, between lawful work and whatever filth this is supposed to be, creeping about in the dark and snatching beasts that belong right here where they are?" Another of the figures raised his wand slightly, not yet casting but readying, and though his face remained hidden, there was impatience in the movement. "You have no authority here," he said. "This operation is protected under Clause 73 of the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, subsection." "I don't care if it's protected under 100 clauses and a dozen subsections," Hagrid interrupted, his voice suddenly rising like a storm breaking over still water, because the attempt to cloak such wrongdoing in bureaucratic language offended him more deeply than open hostility would have done. "You don't collar unicorns, you don't cage Graphorns, and you certainly don't lay traps in this forest and expect to walk out unchallenged, not while I'm standing here." For a brief instant, there was silence. Then the third figure, who had thus far remained slightly behind the others, moved forward just enough for the hem of his cloak to catch upon a branch, and as he pulled it free, Hagrid caught a glimpse of something unexpected. Not a weapon or a mark of allegiance, but a gloved hand adorned with a ring whose stone glowed faintly green even in the low light, a detail so small that another man might have missed it entirely. Yet Hagrid's eyes, trained by years of watching creatures for the slightest sign of change, fixed upon it at once. Before he could speak, the first wizard made a sharp gesture. "Stupefy!" The red jet of light that burst from his wand struck Hagrid squarely in the chest, and though the force of it was enough to stagger an ordinary wizard and send him sprawling into unconsciousness, Hagrid did not fall, for his immense size and the peculiar resilience that came with his half-giant heritage absorbed much of the impact, so that he merely rocked back a step, grunted, and then straightened again with a look that made the attacker hesitate for the briefest fraction of a second. "That all you've got?" Hagrid said, and there was a dangerous edge to the question now, because patience had run out, and action had begun. The forest erupted. From both sides of the hollow, the centaurs surged forward with a speed that defied their size, their hooves striking the earth in a rhythm that echoed like distant drums. And though they did not cast spells in the manner of human wizards, their presence alone altered the space of the conflict, forcing the intruders to shift their attention and divide their focus, which was precisely what Hagrid needed. "Protego!" shouted one of the cloaked figures, throwing up a shimmering barrier just as a second spell from his companion streaked toward Firenze. Yet the centaur twisted aside with effortless grace, the spell passing so close that it singed a lock of his pale hair without touching flesh, while the dark-eyed centaur behind him loosed an arrow that flew straight and true, striking the ground at the attacker's feet with a force that sent him stumbling backward. Hagrid did not wait. He lunged toward the nearest crate, seized the collar about the Graphorn's neck, and with a strength born not merely of muscle but of fierce determination, he tore it free in one brutal motion that snapped the leather and sent the brass tag flying into the mud, where it lay gleaming faintly like a fallen coin. The effect was immediate. The Graphorn reared, its massive form crashing against the crate's walls as the enchantment's hold broke. And for a heartbeat, it seemed as though the creature might lash out blindly at anything within reach. Yet Hagrid spoke quickly, his voice cutting through the chaos with a command that was both firm and familiar. "Easy now, easy. You're safe. No more chains, no more cages. Just hold steady." The creature hesitated. That single moment of hesitation saved them all, because had it charged then, in confusion and pain, the narrow hollow would have become a place of indiscriminate destruction, yet instead it stamped once, twice, and then turned its head toward Hagrid, its golden eyes narrowing as though it recognized not the man himself, but the intent behind him. Behind them, another spell exploded against the trunk of a nearby tree, sending splinters flying, while Fang barked wildly and darted to and fro in a display of courage that was entirely disproportionate to his usual demeanor. And through it all, the three cloaked figures began to falter, their formation breaking under the combined pressure of centaur and gamekeeper, their confidence slipping as the swift resolution they had expected gave way to a confrontation far more difficult than they had planned. "Fall back," one of them shouted. "No," said the masked leader sharply. "We take what we came for." "You've already taken too much," Hagrid roared, turning on them with a force that seemed to fill the entire hollow. And as he did so, he raised his umbrella and brought it down with a swing that struck the side of the remaining sealed crate, shattering the weakened locking mechanism with a crack that rang out like a gunshot. The door burst open. From within came a rush of air and a flash of movement so swift that it was gone almost before it could be seen. A blur of pale wings and slender limbs that vanished into the trees with a sound like wind through leaves. And though Hagrid did not have time to identify the creature, he knew from the shape of it that it had not belonged in any cage. The masked wizard swore. "Enough," he said, and there was no longer any pretense of authority in his voice, only anger and the cold calculation of one who recognized a failing operation. "Withdraw." The others did not argue. In a series of sharp cracks, they disapparated, the sound echoing through the hollow like the snapping of branches under sudden weight. And then they were gone, leaving behind the broken crates, the scattered netting, and the unmistakable evidence of what they had attempted. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Hagrid lowered his umbrella, breathing heavily, and looked around at the damage, the freed creatures, and the dark space where their attackers had stood only seconds before. "They'll be back," he said, not as a question but as a certainty. Firenze inclined his head slightly. "Yes," he said, "for they have not yet finished what they began." Whoa! Hagrid glanced down at the discarded brass tag lying in the mud, its strange symbol glinting faintly in the half-light. And though the immediate danger had passed, a deeper unease settled over him, because whoever had sent those wizards into the forest had done so with preparation, knowledge, and the confidence that came from believing themselves protected. "Well then," he muttered, bending to pick it up once more, his large hand closing around it with quiet resolve. "Next time they come, we'll be ready." For several moments after the last crack of disapparition had died away among the trees, the hollow remained suspended in a strange and uneasy stillness, as though the forest, having risen in outrage against the trespass done within it, now stood listening for some further violence before it would consent to settle once more into its older and deeper rhythm. And in that pause, Hagrid slowly turned where he stood amid the wreckage of broken crates, torn netting, and gouged mud, his breath still heavy in his chest, while the freed Graphorn scraped one forehoof against the ground and gave a low, rumbling snort that seemed less like fear now than wounded indignation. Hagrid knew that this could not be allowed to stand as a mere skirmish survived and then forgotten, because what had happened in the hollow was proof enough that the matter stretched far beyond a few reckless poachers hunting under cover of darkness. For ordinary thieves did not throw around claims of ministry sanction. Ordinary smugglers did not carry collars built to confuse magical creatures into false obedience, and ordinary cowards did not retreat so quickly unless they expected that they would be protected later by something stronger than their own cunning. All of that together painted the outline of a far uglier business, and the longer Hagrid stood considering it, the more strongly he felt that the true danger was not only out here among the roots and thorns, but somewhere much nearer the ordered halls of wizarding authority, where words on parchment could be twisted into weapons more quietly than curses. The centaurs had begun to move through the clearing with grave efficiency, checking the crates, the broken locks, and the surrounding trails. And though none spoke for a little while, Hagrid could sense the same conclusion settling upon them as had settled upon him. Namely, that this night had not ended the matter, but only revealed its scale. Fang, recovering enough courage to behave as though he had personally driven off the attackers, padded stiffly between Hagrid's legs and the uprooted remains of the smashed crate, snuffling loudly at the dirt before recoiling from the smell of unfamiliar magic with a miserable sneezing fit. "Serves you right for putting your nose where it don't belong," Hagrid muttered, though he reached down absently to rub the dog behind the ears, and then, because practical work was often the swiftest path through anger, he turned back to the Graphorn and approached it with the measured calm he would have used for any creature hurt more in trust than in body. The young beast was large already, broader across the chest than many full-grown horses, and armored with that remarkable stony hide which gave Graphorns their reputation for being nearly impossible to subdue by ordinary means. Yet for all its formidable strength, it was not fully grown, and the raw skin beneath the shattered collar showed where restraint and rough handling had caused pain. Hagrid clicked his tongue softly, keeping his movements slow, and after one wary toss of its horned head, the creature allowed him to come near enough to inspect the wound. "Poor thing," he murmured, and there was genuine sorrow in the words, because there were few cruelties he despised more than the mistreatment of magical creatures by people too ignorant or greedy to understand the damage they did. You gave him a fight, didn't you? And good on you for it, too." The Graphorn exhaled hotly through its nostrils and turned its great golden eyes upon him, and Hagrid, reading the tension in the shoulders and the steadier breath, judged that it was no longer on the verge of panic. That was something. Not enough, but something. Firenze approached from the shadowed edge of the hollow, where he had been examining the deeper northern trail, and in his hand he carried a length of broken wood no larger than a man's forearm, though even in the dim light, Hagrid could see that it had once formed part of something far more elaborate than a simple crate slat, for runes had been carved along its side in neat, deliberate rows. "This was taken from the third container," Firenze said. Hagrid straightened, accepted the splintered piece, and squinted down at it. The runes were not of the casual or decorative sort one sometimes saw on imported creature handling equipment, but old-fashioned and exact, chosen with care. And though Hagrid could not read every mark, he knew enough to understand their purpose in broad outline. "Containment," he said, "and Dullen charms. Keeps a creature sluggish, keeps it from recognizing direction proper, maybe keeps it from fighting full strength." Firenze inclined his head. "There is also a binding here for silence." That sent a chill through Hagrid, which had nothing to do with the night air. A crate, enchanted not only to restrain but to muffle cries, meant that the people behind this operation had anticipated transporting living creatures through places where witnesses might hear and ask questions. And that meant roads, checkpoints, perhaps even ministry inspection points crossed with forged papers and confident lies. Such arrangements did not appear overnight. They were built, refined, protected, and that protection had to come from somewhere. The stern centaur, who had thus far given little away beyond sternness and disapproval, now came forward from the southern rim of the hollow and said, "There are tracks leading out in 2 directions, not 1, and the more recent path is lighter, meaning those who fled carried less than those who entered." "They'd already moved some of the creatures," Hagrid said at once, his jaw tightening. "Yes," said the centaur, "and tonight's work was a second gathering, not the first." That truth landed with grim weight. Hagrid looked at the 2 remaining crates, one broken, one empty, and then out through the black bars of tree trunks toward the deeper forest, and in his mind he saw not merely this one raid, but several, perhaps spread over weeks, each one small enough that a missing creature might be explained away by migration, predation, or ordinary danger, especially if the creatures taken were the sort no tallying clerk kept close count of unless ordered to do so. Thestrals, young unicorns, perhaps rare forest birds, perhaps neasels from breeding lines, perhaps even ingredients harvested from creatures too small to track easily. Every possibility made his hands curl into fists. "No more waiting," he said, half to himself and half to the night. "Soon as it's light, I'm taking this straight to Professor McGonagall." Firenze's gaze shifted to him, thoughtful and unreadable as moonlit water. "You trust the castle more than the ministry," he said. "That's right," Hagrid replied without hesitation, because on some matters there was no need for disguise, and loyalty could be stated as plainly as breath. "And after hearing those masked gits talk about clauses and sanction, I trust it even less than I did yesterday." The pale-haired centaur said nothing for a moment, and when he finally spoke, it was in the measured tone of one offering a warning rather than an argument. "If those behind this theft truly possess influence among your officials, then carrying proof to the wrong hands may scatter them before they can be uncovered." Hagrid grimaced, because the centaur had spoken aloud the very problem already troubling him. "Aye," he said, "that's the knot of it, isn't it? We need help, But not from anyone who'll send word ahead to the people doing this." The dark-eyed centaur, who had thus far seemed more eager for pursuit than discussion, glanced toward the trees and said, "Then the question is not whether you seek allies, but whether you already have one among your own kind who knows more than he should." That set Hagrid thinking again of the ring he had glimpsed on the hand of the third masked wizard, a green stone catching light at the wrong moment. And though he could not yet place it exactly, something in the detail nagged at him with the stubbornness of half-remembered familiarity. "Maybe," he muttered. "Or maybe one of 'em's been meeting someone from inside the ministry proper. There was a ring, green stone, flashy sort of thing, didn't fit with the rest of the gear, and I swear I've seen something like it before." "Whoa," Fang barked once as if contributing his own theory, though in truth he had become distracted by the empty third crate and was now investigating it with the air of a dog uncertain whether it might still contain something prepared to bite. Hagrid walked toward that broken container and crouched, pushing aside splinters with one broad hand. The interior smelled faintly of crushed leaves, bitterness, and a sweet mineral note he did not recognize at once. Along the inner wall ran more runes, but between two boards near the back corner something white had caught, lodged in the rough grain where the crate had cracked open under pressure. He pinched it free and held it up. It was a feather, though not from any owl, hawk, or forest bird he knew. It was slender and pale as frost, with a silvery sheen that shifted toward blue where the light touched it. Hagrid stared. "Well now," he said very softly. Firenze stepped beside him and looked too, and even the sternness in his face altered slightly at the sight. "That is not from any creature native to this forest," he said. "No," Hagrid answered, and his voice dropped lower still, because now another piece of the puzzle had turned in a most troubling direction. "But I've seen one like it before, years back, in a ministry transport case from the Eastern Reserves. That's mooncalf feed dust on the floor, mixed with calming herbs. But that feather's from an augury crossbreed, maybe imported, maybe bred illegal. And if they're dealing in creatures from outside Britain as well as stealing from Hogwarts grounds, then this is bigger than I thought." The words seemed to darken the hollow further. Not a local gang, then? Not merely thieves exploiting one vulnerable patch of woodland, but traders moving rare creatures through a network broad enough to mix native captures with imported stock, broad enough to disguise theft as transfer and transfer as legal custody. The idea was so foul in its neatness that Hagrid felt his anger sharpen into resolve. He rose to his full height, the feather and rune-marked splinter in one hand, the brass tag in the other, and looked from the centaurs to the trail leading out of the hollow. "They got away tonight," he said, "but they left too much behind, and if they think Hogwarts is going to sleep through this, they've made the worst mistake of their lives." Then, from somewhere beyond the northern rise, there came the faintest sound of metal striking stone, distant but deliberate, followed by what might have been a door closing where no door ought to be, and every head in the hollow turned toward it at once. Hagrid's eyes narrowed. "There's a hideout," he said, and without another word he began to climb toward the sound. The sound that had drifted through the forest, faint yet unmistakable in its deliberate rhythm, did not belong to any creature known to Hagrid, nor to any natural shifting of the land, but instead carried the unmistakable cadence of human construction hidden beneath concealment charms. And as he climbed the northern rise with heavy yet determined steps, forcing his way through the tight lattice of roots and low branches, he felt with growing certainty that they had reached the edge of something far more carefully hidden than the scattered signs of the poacher's passing had thus far revealed. The centaurs followed, though not all of them, for two remained behind in the hollow to watch over the freed creatures, while Firenze and the dark-eyed tracker moved alongside Hagrid with a quiet readiness that needed no further discussion. And though their hooves made almost no sound upon the damp earth, Hagrid could sense their tension as clearly as he felt his own. Because whatever lay ahead had not merely been visited by the intruders, but had served as a place of purpose, a station in their operation, perhaps even a gateway through which their stolen cargo had already been taken. Fang, whose earlier bravado had once again given way to caution, stayed pressed close to Hagrid's side, his ears flattened, his nose working furiously as he attempted to interpret the tangled scents now thickening in the air. And though he did not understand their meaning, he understood enough to know that they did not belong. At the crest of the rise, the trees parted slightly, not in the open manner of a natural clearing, but in a way that suggested deliberate shaping long ago and careful concealment ever since, and before them lay what appeared at first glance to be nothing more than a tangle of bracken and stone. Yet Hagrid did not trust first glances, especially not in a forest that had already proven itself host to hidden work. He raised his umbrella, letting its faint glow spill forward. There, half buried beneath moss and creeping vine, stood a low stone archway. It was not large enough for a man of Hagrid's size to pass through without bending, and its surface bore no obvious ornamentation. Yet the moment his eyes fell upon it, he felt the subtle pressure of magic, old and layered, pressing outward like a held breath. And he knew at once that this was no natural formation left by time, but a crafted entrance designed to be overlooked. "Hidden well," he muttered. Firenze stepped closer, his gaze sweeping across the stones with that peculiar depth of perception his kind possessed, as though he read not merely the surface of things, but the intent that lay behind them. "Not recent," he said. "This was placed here long before tonight, and long before those who use it now." Hagrid frowned, for that added another piece to the puzzle, one that did not fit easily with the rest, because if the poachers had merely discovered an old passage and made use of it, then their knowledge of the forest extended farther than he had assumed. But if they had been directed to it by someone who already knew its existence, then the chain of involvement stretched deeper still. "Step back," he said. He extended the umbrella toward the archway and spoke a quiet, revealing charm. And though he did not expect it to work entirely, for such concealments were rarely undone so easily, the effect was enough to stir the surface of the illusion, causing the moss to shimmer briefly, and the outline of a narrow stone door set within the arch to become visible, its edges marked with faint runes similar in style to those he had seen carved into the crate splinter. "Same hand," Hagrid said under his breath. "Or at least same sort of magic." The dark-eyed centaur lowered himself slightly, bringing his face closer to the ground, and after a moment he said, "They passed through here not long ago, carrying weight, though fewer than before." "Then this is where they went," Hagrid replied, and though his voice remained steady, there was a tightening in his chest, because stepping into a hidden passage beneath the Forbidden Forest in pursuit of armed wizards was not a task he would have chosen lightly under any circumstances. And yet there was no question now of turning back, not with the evidence they had found and the creatures they had already freed. He reached for the edge of the concealed door and pressed. For a moment nothing happened, and then, with a low, grinding sound that seemed far too loud in the close air, the stone shifted inward, revealing a narrow stairway descending into darkness. A breath of cold air rose from below, carrying with it the scent of damp stone, iron, and something else that Hagrid could not immediately place. Something faintly sweet, yet edged with bitterness. like the residue of potions brewed in haste and sealed away before their fumes could fully dissipate. "Well then," he said quietly, "down we go." Fang made a noise of profound objection. "Stay close," Hagrid added, and without waiting for further hesitation, he ducked beneath the arch and began to descend. The stairway was steep, uneven, and worn by time, its edges smoothed by centuries of use or neglect, and as they moved downward, the light from Hagrid's umbrella cast long, wavering shadows along the walls, revealing occasional carvings half erased by age and damp, none of which bore any resemblance to the marks he had seen on the crates, suggesting that the passage itself predated the current operation by a considerable margin. After several turns, the stairs leveled into a narrow corridor, its ceiling low enough that Hagrid was forced to stoop continuously. And though the space was silent, save for the faint echo of their own movement, there was a sense of recent activity in the air, as though the place had been disturbed after a long period of stillness. "Tracks," Firenze said softly. Hagrid followed his gaze and saw them, faint impressions in the dust, booted feet, several sets, moving in and out, overlapping in a pattern that spoke of repeated use rather than a single passage, and among them were the deeper marks left by dragged weight, likely the crates they had seen above. The corridor led onward for some distance before opening into a larger chamber, and when Hagrid stepped into it, he stopped short, his eyes widening slightly despite himself. The room had once been a storage hall, perhaps part of some forgotten structure long swallowed by the forest, but now it had been repurposed with ruthless efficiency, its walls lined with empty racks. Its center occupied by a heavy wooden table upon which lay an assortment of tools, vials, and parchment, and along one side stood several more crates, smaller than those in the hollow, but marked with the same runes and fitted with the same iron bands. "Merlin's beard," Hagrid breathed. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and lifted one of the vials from the table, uncorking it carefully and sniffing the contents with a practiced caution. "Sedative," he said. "Strong one, too. Enough to keep even a Graphorn docile if dosed right." Firenze moved to the far side of the chamber, where a stack of parchment lay partially concealed beneath a folded cloth, and as he lifted the top sheet, his expression changed, not dramatically, but enough for Hagrid to notice. "What is it?" Hagrid asked. Firenze turned the parchment so that the dim light fell across it. It was a list, not names, not in the ordinary sense, but classifications, species, ages, and beside each entry a set of symbols that matched those on the brass tags, along with dates and quantities that left no room for misinterpretation. Hagrid felt his stomach drop. "This ain't just tonight," he said. "This is a ledger." The dark-eyed centaur stepped closer, reading over Firenze's shoulder. "And not a complete one," he added. "Only a portion of what has passed through here." Hagrid set the vial down slowly. "And if this is only part," he said, "then there's more we haven't seen." At that moment, from deeper within the chamber, there came a faint sound. Not the echo of their own movement, not the drip of water or the shift of stone, but a low, muffled thump, followed by the unmistakable rattle of chains. Hagrid turned. "There's another room," he said. And without waiting, he moved toward the sound. The sound of chains, faint yet persistent in its rhythm, carried through the stone chamber with a quality that made it far more unsettling than any sudden noise could have been, for it spoke not of immediate violence, but of prolonged captivity, of something alive that had been restrained long enough to learn the limits of its prison, and yet had not ceased entirely to resist. And as Hagrid moved toward the darker recess at the far end of the room, His steps grew heavier with each passing moment, because he knew before he reached the threshold that whatever lay beyond it would confirm the worst of what they had already begun to suspect. The entrance to the adjoining space was narrower than the main chamber, and partly concealed behind a stack of empty crates that had been carelessly pushed aside in haste. And as Hagrid forced his way through them, splintering one beneath the pressure of his shoulder without even noticing it, the dim light from his umbrella spilled into the adjoining room and revealed a sight that caused him to stop dead where he stood, his broad frame filling the doorway. It was not a storage chamber. It was a holding pen. Iron rings had been fixed into the walls at regular intervals, each one connected to lengths of heavy chain that lay coiled or stretched across the stone floor, and though several of them hung empty, swaying slightly as if they had only recently been disturbed, others remained fastened to living creatures, some small, some larger, all of them bearing the same unmistakable signs of restraint, exhaustion, and confusion that came from prolonged exposure to enchantments designed to suppress instinct and will. Closest to the entrance, half collapsed against the wall, lay a Kneazle with fur matted and eyes dulled, its tail twitching weakly as it attempted to rise and failed. While farther back, a pair of bowtruckles clung to a splintered branch, hastily wedged into a crack in the stone, their tiny forms trembling as they watched the newcomers with a mixture of fear and fragile hope. And beyond them, in the deepest shadow where the light barely reached, something larger shifted, its movement producing the very sound of chains that had drawn them there. Hagrid's breath came slow and deep. "Easy now," he said, though the words were not directed at any one creature in particular, but rather spoken into the room itself, as though he might soothe its tension simply by refusing to match it. "Nobody's going to hurt you any further. Not while I'm here." The Kneazle lifted its head slightly at the sound of his voice, and though it did not yet move toward him, the faintest spark of awareness returned to its gaze, as if some buried instinct recognized the difference between threat and aid. Behind Hagrid, Firenze entered the room with a quiet step, his presence altering the air in a way that seemed to calm the smaller creatures almost immediately, for though they feared men, they did not fear the centaurs in the same way, and the dark-eyed tracker followed, his expression tightening as he took in the scene before him. "This place is not for transport," he said. "It is for gathering." "Aye," Hagrid replied, his voice thick with anger that he held firmly in check. "They bring 'em here first, keep 'em quiet, sort 'em, maybe wait till they've got enough to move in one go." He moved carefully into the room, stepping over chains and scattered debris, his great hands already reaching for the nearest restraints. And though the metal links had been strengthened with magic, they were not made to withstand the kind of force he could bring to bear when properly motivated, so that one by one the rings tore free from their fittings or snapped outright, falling to the floor with dull, heavy clanks that echoed against the stone. The bowtruckles did not wait for further encouragement, but fled at once the moment their branch was freed, darting past him and vanishing into the main chamber with a speed born of long-suppressed instinct, while the Kneazle staggered upright and padded uncertainly toward the doorway, pausing only once to glance back as though to confirm that its escape was real before disappearing after them. Only the larger creature remained. Hagrid approached it slowly, his eyes adjusting to the deeper shadow, and as the light from his umbrella reached farther into that corner, the shape resolved itself into something that made him pause for just a fraction longer than he had intended. It was a Diricol. Not unusual in itself, for the species was known to inhabit parts of the forest, but this one bore markings that suggested a rarer strain, its plumage tinged with iridescent hues that shifted subtly between blue and green. and more importantly, it did not vanish at once upon sensing his presence, as diricals were prone to do, but remained where it was, its body held in place by a collar whose enchantment clearly interfered with its natural ability to disapparate. "Well now," Hagrid murmured, "that's how they keep you from popping off, is it?" The bird gave a soft, frustrated chirr that seemed almost indignant. Hagrid reached for the collar, but as his fingers closed around it, the dirical flinched violently, and for a moment he thought it might injure itself in the attempt to escape. So he withdrew his hand slightly and spoke again, his tone softer, more patient. "Hold on now. No rush. I'll not hurt you. Just need to get this off proper." It took longer than with the grapphorn, for the fastening was smaller and more intricate, but at last the clasp gave way, and the moment the collar fell free, the dirical vanished with a sharp crack of displaced air, leaving behind nothing but a few drifting feathers and the faintest shimmer where it had been. Hagrid exhaled. That's that, then. Yet, even as he said it, he knew it was not that simple, because the room, though now empty of captives, still bore the weight of what had been done within it, and more importantly, the presence of such a place beneath the forest meant that those responsible had invested time, effort, and resources into establishing it, which in turn meant that they would not abandon it lightly, even after tonight's disruption. Firenze, who had moved back toward the main chamber, now spoke from the doorway. "There is more," he said. Hagrid turned at once and followed him out, his eyes already searching for whatever new detail had caught the centaur's attention, and as he stepped back into the larger room, he saw that Firenze stood beside the wooden table, where he had uncovered a second set of parchments hidden beneath the first. "These were not meant to be found quickly," Firenze said. Hagrid approached, and as he looked down at the pages, his expression darkened further still. Unlike the ledger they had already seen, which listed creatures and quantities, this document contained names. Not of beasts, but of people. Some were written in full, others reduced to initials, and beside each entry were notes, dates, and what appeared to be payments or allocations, marked in a shorthand that suggested familiarity with the system it described. Hagrid's finger hovered over one line. "CLV," he read quietly. The same initials as on the brass tag. "That's no coincidence," he said. "That's the one in charge, or close enough to it?" The dark-eyed centaur leaned closer. "And these others?" "Helpers," Hagrid replied grimly. "Suppliers, maybe lookouts, maybe folk in places where questions get asked, and then quietly forgotten." He traced another line. Then another. And then he stopped. Because one of the names, written in a careful, deliberate hand, wasn't unfamiliar to him at all. He did not speak it aloud. Instead, he straightened slowly, the parchment still held in his hand, and for the first time since entering the hollow, his anger shifted into something colder, more focused, and far more dangerous. "Well," he said, his voice low and steady, "that explains a great deal." Firenze watched him closely. "You recognize it?" Hagrid nodded once. "Aye," he said, "and I wish I didn't." At that moment, from somewhere deeper within the passageways beyond the chamber, there came the faint echo of footsteps, distant but approaching, and though they were muffled by stone and distance, there was no mistaking the direction from which they came. Hagrid folded the parchment, slipped it into his coat, and turned toward the sound. "Looks like we've got company," he said. And this time, he did not intend to let them escape. The approaching footsteps did not carry the careless rhythm of those who believed themselves alone and unobserved, but instead moved with a measured caution that suggested experience, discipline, and the expectation of danger. And as the sound echoed faintly through the stone corridors beyond the chamber, Hagrid felt a tightening in his chest that had little to do with fear and much to do with the certainty that whatever remained hidden behind this operation had not yet revealed its full shape. He motioned once to the centaurs, not with words but with a brief, deliberate gesture, and though they did not operate by the same unspoken signals as human companions might, they understood enough of intent to respond in kind, moving swiftly and silently to positions along the edges of the chamber where shadow and stone might conceal their presence until the right moment, while Hagrid himself stepped just inside the entrance to the holding room, his massive form partially obscured by the broken crates he had already pushed aside. Fang, who had no talent whatsoever for stealth, and even less for patience, was guided behind a fallen beam with a firm hand and a whispered command that he obeyed only because the tone admitted no argument. And though he continued to tremble, he did so quietly, which was all that could reasonably be expected of him. The footsteps grew nearer. There were 2 of them, Hagrid realized, perhaps 3, their pace steady, their weight shifting slightly differently with each step, suggesting not a single coordinated unit, but individuals accustomed to moving together without the need for constant communication. And when at last they reached the edge of the chamber, the faint glow of their wands preceded them, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls before their figures themselves emerged into view. They were cloaked, as the others had been. Yet there was a difference in their bearing that did not escape Hagrid's notice, for these did not hold themselves like hired hands or expendable operatives, but with the quiet confidence of those who expected to give orders rather than receive them. And though their faces were again concealed, the subtle details of their attire, the quality of the fabric, the precision of their movements, spoke of a higher rank within whatever structure governed this illicit trade. "Well," said the first, his voice low and composed, lacking the earlier distortion charm, and thus revealing a tone that was both educated and faintly impatient, as though inconvenience rather than danger concerned him most. "It would seem that our evening's work has not proceeded entirely as planned." The second figure stepped forward, his wand light sweeping across the chamber, illuminating the empty chains, the broken crates, and the disturbed table with a cold, assessing gaze. "No," he replied, and there was irritation in his voice now, sharpened by the evidence before him. "And unless I am mistaken, we have been preceded by someone who understood precisely where to look." Hagrid felt the words settle into place. Not random discovery, then, not a chance encounter, but a recognition that their hidden station had been deliberately uncovered, and that realization, more than any spell, altered the tone of the encounter from defensive to dangerous. The first man moved farther into the room, his cloak brushing lightly against the stone, and as he did so, the faint green gleam of a ring upon his gloved hand caught the light of his companion's wand. And in that instant, Hagrid knew beyond any doubt that this was the same figure he had glimpsed in the hollow. The same hand, the same stone, the same quiet authority. "You may as well step out," the man said calmly, without raising his voice, as though addressing an unseen audience he already knew to be present. There is little point in prolonging this particular charade. Hagrid did not move at once. He waited. The silence stretched, thin and deliberate, until at last the second man gave a short, impatient exhale. "They are here," he said. "I can feel it." That was enough. Hagrid stepped forward, straightening to his full height as he emerged from behind the crates. And though the chamber was not large, his presence seemed to fill it entirely, forcing the intruders to take an involuntary half-step back before they mastered themselves. "You're right about one thing," Hagrid said, his voice low and steady, carrying a weight that made the air itself seem heavier. "There ain't much point in hiding anymore." The first man regarded him for a moment, his gaze unreadable behind the mask, and then he inclined his head slightly, not in greeting but in acknowledgement. "The Hogwarts gamekeeper," he said. "I had wondered whether you would involve yourself personally, or whether this would be left to less formidable representatives." Hagrid's grip tightened around his umbrella. "You've done enough damage without me standing aside," he replied, "and I reckon it's time someone put a stop to it." The second man laughed softly, though there was no humor in the sound. "Stop?" he repeated. "You misunderstand the nature of what you have stumbled into, my large friend. This is not some petty poaching venture to be frightened off by a show of strength and indignation. This is a system, carefully constructed, legally shielded, and financially supported by individuals far beyond the reach of a groundskeeper's authority." Hagrid took a step forward. "Funny thing about authority," he said. "Sometimes it don't matter half as much as doing what's right." At that moment, from the edges of the chamber, the centaurs emerged, their presence adding a silent and unmistakable pressure to the space. And for the first time, the composure of the intruders faltered, not entirely, but enough to reveal that they had not anticipated facing opposition from both man and forest alike. The first man's gaze shifted briefly to Firenze, then back to Hagrid. "This complicates matters," he said. "Good," Hagrid replied. There was a pause. Then, slowly, the masked figure raised his hand, not in preparation to cast, but to remove the covering from his face. The metal mask came away with a soft click. And beneath it was a face Hagrid knew. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to narrow. "Mr. Carrow," Hagrid said quietly. The man smiled. "Ah," he said, "so you do remember me." Hagrid did. A minor official once attached to the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, a man who had visited Hogwarts on more than one occasion under the pretense of inspection, whose manner had always been polite, whose questions had always been precise, and whose interest in certain species had, in hindsight, lingered just a little too long. "You were always asking about rare creatures," Hagrid said, his voice hardening. "Always wanting to know numbers, habits, locations." "Professional curiosity," Carrow replied smoothly. "Nothing more." "Looks like a bit more than that now," Hagrid growled. Carrow's smile did not falter. "You see only the surface," he said. "You see suffering and assume cruelty. You see containment and assume theft. But you do not see the larger picture, the necessity, the demand, the delicate balance between preservation and utilization that governs our world." "That's a fancy way of saying you're selling creatures," Hagrid shot back. "And if I am?" Carrow said, his tone sharpening just slightly. "Would you prefer they be left to vanish in a forest that grows more unstable by the year, prey to forces you neither understand nor control? Or would you rather they be placed where they may be studied, bred, protected, and yes, perhaps even traded, in a system that ensures their continued existence?" Hagrid stared at him. For a moment the argument hung there, wrapped in words designed to sound reasonable, even noble. Then Hagrid shook his head slowly. "You're talking rubbish," he said, "and deep down, I reckon you know it." Carrow's expression cooled. "You are not in a position to judge," he said, "nor are you in a position to interfere further." His wand came up. So did Hagrid's umbrella. And the forest, even here beneath the earth, seemed to hold its breath once more as the confrontation reached its breaking point. The first spell was Carrow's, and it came not as a reckless burst of temper, but as a precise and vicious stroke of green-white light that struck the stone floor where Hagrid had stood a heartbeat earlier, blasting shards of rock across the chamber and filling the underground air with a bitter smell of scorched dust. Yet Hagrid had already thrown himself sideways with surprising speed for a man of his size. And though the movement jarred every bone in his body, it spared him the worst of the curse and bought the instant the centaurs needed. Firenze moved like an arrow released before the bowstring could be seen, his wandless magic flashing in a pale curve through the dimness as the second wizard tried to pivot toward him. And at the same moment the dark-eyed centaur sprang from the chamber wall with such force that his hooves struck sparks from the stone, driving the man backward into the edge of the table, where vials, parchments, and bits of iron restraint flew in every direction, like leaves caught in a gale. Caro did not retreat, which told Hagrid much about him in that single instant, because some men, once cornered, fled toward safety, whereas others fled toward escalation, and Caro belonged plainly to the second kind, for rather than seek the tunnel behind him, he advanced with a speed and skill that ill-suited the harmless ministry inspector he had once pretended to be. His wand cut sharply through the air. "Incarcerus!" Me. Ropes burst from the tip of it like striking serpents, thick and fast, and aimed not at Hagrid's hands or feet, but at his throat and chest, designed not merely to restrain, but to bring down his bulk by choking breath and balance together. Yet Hagrid, who had broken chains with his bare hands that very night, seized the first cord as it struck him, wrapped it once around his forearm, and with a bellow of effort yanked so hard that Caro himself lurched forward off balance. "Bad idea," Hagrid growled. He heaved. The rope snapped taut between them, and Caro was dragged several feet across the floor, his boots skidding over spilled potion and broken glass until he crashed hard against the splintered remains of one of the crates. His wand arm wavered only for an instant, but that instant was enough for Fang, who had thus far contributed chiefly through trembling devotion, to launch himself from behind the fallen beam, with a bark so loud and furious that it startled everyone in the room, himself included. He did not reach Caro, because the second wizard kicked a stool into his path and sent him tumbling in a yelp. Yet the interruption mattered, because it broke the rhythm of the duel and turned a neat exchange of prepared force into chaos. The second wizard had recovered his footing by then, and was dueling the dark-eyed centaur at close quarters, which was a deeply unenviable position for any human who valued his bones, for though the centaur did not wield a wand, he fought with speed, reach, and a terrifying certainty of movement, using the confined chamber with far more ease than should have been possible for his size. A slash of spell light burned past his shoulder. He twisted. A rear hoof struck the wizard in the ribs with a crack that sent him sprawling against the wall, gasping. Caro shouted something sharp and unfamiliar, not a common dueling spell, but a command. From deeper in the tunnel behind him came an answering sound. Metal scraped. A gate lifted. And then Hagrid understood with a fresh surge of anger what those noises meant, because Caro had not come back to the underground station merely to inspect damage or retrieve papers. He had come because something else was hidden farther in, something worth defending, something perhaps too valuable to abandon even after the raid had begun to fall apart. "You've got more creatures down there," Hagrid roared. Caro's expression, controlled though it was, changed for the smallest fraction of a second, and that was answer enough. Then the tunnel vomited movement. Not a monster, not a beast set loose for slaughter, but 3 enchanted iron frames on wheels, each no taller than a man's waist, rolling forward under their own power like grotesque little cages with jointed legs, their bars crackling with containment spells, and their fronts fitted with grasping hooks designed to clamp around living bodies. They were traps made mobile, ugly inventions of wizarding craft bent toward cruelty, and as they scuttled into the chamber, they split apart with mechanical intelligence. One darting toward Hagrid's knees, another veering for Firenze, and the third lunging toward the scattered parchments on the floor, as if under orders to retrieve evidence before anything else. "Oh, no, you don't," Hagrid snarled. He brought his umbrella down on the nearest iron frame with all the force of his shoulder and back behind it. The device crumpled sideways under the blow, one wheel spinning uselessly as sparks spat from its broken joints, yet the second had already sprung, its hooks snapping shut around his left boot and hauling with alarming strength. The metal bit into leather and tried to ratchet upward. Hagrid stamped once, twice, the whole chamber shaking with the impact, but the thing clung on. Only when he bent, seized it with both hands, and tore it clean in half did it finally release him, dropping to the floor in twitching fragments. Across the room, Firenze had fared better, because the cage sent for him never had a chance to touch him at all. With the calm elegance that so often made his deadliness easy to underestimate, he drew from the ground not a wand movement, but a burst of pale golden force that seemed to rise through the old stone itself. The machine froze in mid-lunge as though seized by invisible roots, then buckled inward until its iron bars screeched and split. The third mechanism, however, nearly escaped. It had already scooped half the scattered documents into its grasping hooks and was skittering back toward the tunnel when Fang, in a fit of courage no one present would ever have believed possible from him, hurled himself directly into its side. The collision tipped the frame over, sending papers spraying across the floor. Fang yelped, the machine hissed and snapped, and Hagrid crossed the distance in 2 enormous strides, kicked the contraption into the wall, and crushed it flat under his heel. "That's my dog," he said, hauling Fang up by the scruff just long enough to set him behind his boots again, where the boarhound stood shaking with equal parts terror and pride. Caro chose that moment to disillusion himself. One blink he was there, wand raised, coat torn at the shoulder, and the next he blurred and vanished into the dim air of the chamber, not fully gone, but hidden enough that only a warped shimmer marked where he moved. The second wizard, clutching his side and breathing in ragged bursts, tried the same, but the dark-eyed centaur was too fast. An arrow, loosed from almost point-blank range, pinned the man's cloak to a crate and left him cursing on the stones, visible and very much trapped. "Hagrid," Firenze called. Hagrid turned in time to see a flash of movement where no body could be clearly seen, only distortion slipping toward the tunnel that led deeper into the complex. He did not think. He charged. The corridor beyond was lower still, forcing him to duck as he thundered after the faint shimmer. Caro flung curses over his shoulder as he ran, bolts of red and blue light striking wall and ceiling, showering Hagrid with chips of stone and dust, yet none landed squarely, and Hagrid pressed on with the unstoppable momentum of a landslide. The tunnel bent sharply. A concealed door stood ajar ahead, and through it spilled a dim yellow glow, warmer than the wand light behind, steadier too, like lamps burning over deliberate work. Caro slipped through. Hagrid hit the doorway a heartbeat later and nearly tore it from its hinges. The chamber beyond was larger than the others, and far worse. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with jars of ingredients, labeled vials, bundles of hair, horns, feathers, scales, and other things Hagrid did not allow himself to catalog too closely, because too many had plainly come from living creatures by means that no decent person would defend. Along the center stood 6 transport cages, 3 occupied, 3 empty, and beside them a long desk piled with sealed documents bearing ministry stamps. Not forged ones, real ones. For a moment that struck him harder than any curse had done. Caro stood at the far end of the room, visible again now, one hand pressed to the green ring at his finger, the other holding his wand out toward Hagrid with absolute steadiness. "You should not have come this far," he said. "Funny," Hagrid replied, breathing hard but standing taller than ever in the low space. "I was just thinking the same about you." Then he glanced at the occupied cages. Inside one crouched a pale winged creature no bigger than a large swan, its eyes luminous and exhausted. Inside another trembled two tiny moon calves, their knees tucked beneath them unnaturally, as if they had been dosed too deeply to stand. And in the third, chained by the leg to the rear bar, was something Hagrid recognized only after a horrified second look. A newborn thestral foal, scarcely more than bones, hide, and shivering wings. Caro saw where his gaze had gone. His mouth curved into something that wished to be a smile and failed. "Now," he said softly, "perhaps you begin to understand the scale." "No," Hagrid said, and his voice had become so quiet that it sounded more dangerous than any shout. "Now I understand exactly what kind of man ye are." Behind him, from the tunnel, came the sound of hooves and pursuit. Ahead, Caro's wand tip brightened with gathering light. Between them stood the cages, and Hagrid knew that the next few seconds would decide not only whether Caro escaped, but whether the truth ever reached Hogwarts at all. The chamber seemed to draw inward upon itself, as though the very stones recognized that what would unfold within its confines carried a weight far beyond the confines of that hidden place. And for a single suspended instant, neither Hagrid nor Caro moved. Yet in that silence, the truth of their positions sharpened into something undeniable, because between them stood not merely a disagreement of purpose, but a line that could not be crossed without consequence. And both knew that whichever one yielded in the next breath would determine whether the creatures in those cages lived free or vanished into the machinery of a trade that thrived precisely because it remained unseen. Caro moved first. His wand slashed through the air in a swift, precise arc, and from its tip burst a spell unlike those he had used before. Not a simple curse or binding charm, but a layered incantation that struck the ground at Hagrid's feet and spread outward in a shimmering lattice of force, rising in a half-circle that sought to trap him where he stood, cutting him off from the cages while leaving Caro himself free to retreat deeper into the complex. "Confinement array," Caro said, his voice steady, almost instructional, as though he took a certain pride in the spell's elegance. "A temporary measure, I assure you, but sufficient for my purposes." The lattice flared brighter, its edges hardening like glass. Hagrid did not step back. Instead, he stepped forward into it. The moment his body struck the barrier, the chamber rang with a deep, resonant hum, the magic straining against something it had not been designed to contain, because though the spell was precise, efficient, and undoubtedly powerful against ordinary resistance, it had not been crafted with a half-giant in mind. And as Hagrid leaned his weight into it, the shimmering surface bowed, held, and then began to crack along lines of stress that spread outward from the point of impact, like fractures in ice. Caro's eyes narrowed. "Impressive," he said softly, and for the first time there was something like genuine interest in his tone, though it did not lessen the danger of what he intended to do next. Hagrid roared. With a single surge of effort that seemed to draw upon every ounce of strength in his massive frame, he drove forward, and the barrier shattered with a sound like breaking crystal, its fragments dissolving into sparks that faded before they touched the ground. "Ye picked the wrong place to try clever tricks," Hagrid growled. Caro did not waste time arguing. Instead, he pivoted sharply and directed his wand toward the cages, not to open them, but to activate something within them, and at once the runes etched along their bars flared to life, glowing with a harsh, pulsing light that caused the creatures inside to cry out in distress, their bodies stiffening as the enchantments tightened, amplifying the effects of the collars and restraints that held them. "Stand down," Caro said, his voice cutting through the rising tension with cold authority, "or I assure you that their suffering will increase before you can reach them." Hagrid froze. It was not fear for himself that halted him, nor uncertainty, but the immediate and undeniable reality that Caro held leverage, and though Hagrid would have gladly taken any blow meant for him, he could not ignore the way the mooncalves trembled or the way the thestral foal struggled weakly against its chain. For a moment, the balance shifted. Caro saw it. "Now," he continued more quietly, "we may proceed with a measure of reason. You have disrupted an operation that extends far beyond this location, and while that is regrettable, it is not irreparable. You will step aside. You will forget what you have seen here tonight, and in return, I will ensure that these particular creatures are transferred under conditions that you might, if you chose to be generous, describe as humane." Hagrid's jaw tightened. "Humane?" he repeated, and though he did not raise his voice, the word carried a weight that made even the stone walls seem to listen. "You call this humane?" Caro's expression did not change. "I call it necessary," he said. Behind Hagrid, the sound of approaching hooves grew louder, and though Caro heard it as well, he did not turn, for he understood that his moment of control depended on maintaining the tension before him, not the threat behind. Hagrid took a breath, then another. And in those two breaths something shifted, not in the chamber, but within him, because for all his strength, for all his anger, for all his instinct to act, there was also in him a deep and unwavering understanding of creatures, not merely how to care for them, but how to reach them, how to calm them, how to give them the space to act in their own nature when human interference had done enough harm. He looked at the cages, at the trembling mooncalves, at the struggling thestral, and then, slowly, he lowered his umbrella. Caro's eyes flickered, not with relief, but with a brief, calculating curiosity. "Good," he said. "A wise choice." Hagrid did not answer. Instead, he began to speak, his voice low and steady, directed not at Caro, but at the creatures themselves, and though the words were simple, there was something in the tone that carried beyond language, something that reached into the confusion and fear imposed upon them by magic, and reminded them, faintly, of something older and stronger. "Easy now," he murmured. "Don't fight the wrong thing. Hold on. Just hold on." The mooncalves stilled, just slightly. The thestral's frantic movements slowed. Caro frowned. "What are you doing?" he demanded. Hagrid did not look at him. "Letting them remember what they are," he said quietly. And in that moment, as the creature's panic shifted into a fragile stillness, Hagrid moved. Not toward Caro, but toward the cages. With a speed that belied his size, he crossed the distance in 2 strides and brought his umbrella down against the lock of the nearest cage, not with brute force alone, but with a precisely aimed strike that shattered the rune anchoring the restraint enchantment. And though the bars did not break, the magic holding them did, flickering violently as the structure destabilized. Caro shouted. "Stop him!" Oi, but it was too late. The chamber erupted. Firenze burst through the doorway at that instant, his presence breaking whatever fragile control Caro had maintained, while the dark-eyed centaur followed close behind, and together they surged into the room, their combined force turning the narrow space into a storm of motion and sound. Hagrid struck the second cage. Then the third. One by one, the enchantments failed. The doors sprang open. The creatures, freed not only from physical restraint, but from the oppressive magic that had dulled their instincts, reacted as nature demanded. The mooncalves bolted. The winged creature launched itself into the air, colliding with the low ceiling before finding the doorway and vanishing into the corridor beyond. And the thestral foal. The thestral foal spread its wings. It did not flee immediately. Instead, it turned its pale eyes toward Hagrid for a single, fleeting moment. Then it leapt. Caro tried to act. His wand came up. But Hagrid was faster. With a swing that carried the full force of his anger, his strength, and his refusal to allow another creature to be taken, he struck Caro's arm, sending the wand spinning across the chamber, where it clattered uselessly against the far wall. The green ring on Caro's hand flared. For a heartbeat, something strange rippled through the air around him. Then he vanished, not with the sharp crack of disapparation, but with a silent, unnatural distortion that left no trace behind. Hagrid stood still. The chamber fell quiet. And in that quiet, as the last echoes of the freed creatures faded into the tunnels beyond, one truth settled over them all. Caro had escaped. But his operation had not. For a long moment after the unnatural distortion in the air had faded, and the space where Caro had stood became nothing more than empty stone and scattered debris, the chamber remained steeped in a heavy, echoing silence, as though the walls themselves struggled to comprehend the abrupt vanishing of the man who had moments before commanded it with such cold authority. And in that stillness, Hagrid stood unmoving, his great chest rising and falling slowly as he stared at the place where the green ring had flared, and the figure had dissolved into nothingness, without so much as the crack of ordinary disapparation. That was not a standard departure, Firenze said at last, his voice quiet but certain, for there was no mistaking the difference between a spell that obeyed known rules and one that bent them into something unfamiliar. And the unease that settled over the room at those words deepened into something more troubling than the simple frustration of a quarry lost. "No," Hagrid replied, his tone roughened by the effort of holding his anger in check, because the urge to pursue, to tear through the passageways until he found the hidden exit or the concealed mechanism that had allowed such an escape, pressed hard against his instincts. Yet he knew better than to give in to it without thought. For the tunnels might hold traps, wards, or worse, and the creatures they had just freed still needed protection above all else. The dark-eyed centaur moved cautiously through the chamber, examining the place where Caro had vanished, and after a moment he knelt, touching the stone with his fingertips, as though he might read the lingering magic from its surface. "There is a residue," he said, frowning slightly. "But it is layered, complex, and not entirely of one origin, which suggests that the escape was not improvised but prepared in advance, perhaps anchored to an object or a mark carried upon the body." "The ring," Hagrid said at once, his gaze sharpening as he recalled the way the green stone had flared with unnatural intensity at the moment of disappearance. And though he had seen many magical artifacts in his time, there had been something distinctly wrong about that particular glow, something that did not belong to any common charm or device. Firenze inclined his head. Yes, he said. It is likely that the object served as a key or a conduit, allowing him to pass through a boundary that remains closed to others. Hagrid let out a slow breath. Then we've got one less way to catch him tonight, he muttered, though there was no defeat in the words, only a grim acknowledgement of the truth, because though Caro had escaped, he had not done so cleanly, and the damage left behind in his wake was far too great to be hidden or ignored. Around them, the chamber bore the unmistakable marks of a broken operation, the cages flung open, the runes disrupted, the shelves half emptied or overturned in the chaos of the confrontation. And though some of the more portable materials had likely already been removed in earlier transports, enough remained to tell a story that no clever explanation could entirely obscure. Hagrid moved toward the desk where the sealed documents lay, his heavy boots crunching over splintered wood and scattered glass. And as he gathered them into one large hand, he noted with a grim satisfaction that the ministry seals upon them were not merely decorative, but official, bearing the proper markings that would be difficult to forge convincingly, which meant that whoever had authorized them had done so either through deception or with full knowledge of their purpose. Proof, he said, holding the bundle up slightly, as though weighing its importance against the risks they had taken to obtain it. Not just bits and pieces, but enough to show what's been going on here. And enough to anger those who benefit from it, the stern centaur replied, his gaze steady and unflinching, because though the immediate danger had passed, the implications of what they had uncovered extended far beyond the confines of the forest. Hagrid nodded once. Aye, he said, but that can't be helped. Fang, who had finally emerged from his hiding place with a mixture of caution and renewed curiosity, padded uncertainly through the room, sniffing at the broken remains of the iron devices and the scattered potions, and though he gave a small, unhappy whine at the lingering scent of distress, he did not retreat, which Hagrid took as a sign that the immediate threat had indeed passed. Right then, Hagrid said, turning back towards the tunnel, his expression settling into a look of firm resolve that left no doubt as to his intentions. We've done what we can down here for now, and the creatures we freed'll be making their way back to the forest if they've any strength left. But this place ain't safe to leave as it is, not with traps still hidden and paths still open. Firenze stepped beside him. What do you propose? He asked. Hagrid glanced once more around the chamber, his eyes taking in every detail, every broken crate, every overturned table, every scrap of evidence that spoke of the operation's scale, and though he knew that destroying the place outright might prevent its immediate reuse, he also understood that doing so would erase traces that might prove vital in exposing those responsible. We seal it, he said. Not destroy it, not yet, but close it off so no one else gets in or out without knowing what they're dealing with. And then we take what we've found straight to Professor McGonagall. And the ministry? The dark-eyed centaur asked. Hagrid's jaw tightened slightly. Later, he said, once we know who can be trusted. There was no argument to that. Together they moved back through the chambers, retracing their path toward the concealed entrance, and as they did so, Hagrid paused only long enough to ensure that no creature remained behind, no chain unbroken, no hidden corner left unchecked. For though he trusted that most had fled at the first opportunity, he would not risk leaving any living thing to suffer in that place longer than it already had. When at last they reached the stone archway and stepped once more into the forest air, the difference was immediate and profound. For the night, though still heavy with the memory of what had occurred, seemed wider, freer, as though the trees themselves had exhaled in quiet relief at the disruption of the hidden harm beneath their roots. Hagrid turned back once, studying the archway. "Won't stay hidden now," he said. "No." Firenze agreed. "Not to those who know to look." Hagrid nodded. "Good," he said. Then, with a few carefully chosen spells and a great deal of physical effort, he and the centaurs shifted fallen stone, tangled roots, and heavy branches across the entrance, not sealing it permanently, but making it difficult enough to access that no casual return would be possible without time and labor. And when the work was done, Hagrid stepped back, wiping his hands against his coat as he looked at the concealed passage one last time. "Come mornin'," he said. "This won't be a secret anymore." And with that, carrying the evidence of what they had uncovered and the weight of what still remained unresolved, he turned toward Hogwarts, knowing that the final part of the struggle would not take place in the shadows of the forest, but in the light of truth that would follow. By the time the first faint line of dawn began to touch the horizon beyond the Black Lake, casting a pale silver glow across the sloping grounds of Hogwarts, Rubeus Hagrid had already crossed the boundary between forest and open land, his great stride steady despite the long night behind him, his coat heavy with damp and the lingering scent of stone and shadow, while in his broad hand he carried not merely a bundle of parchments and marked tokens, but the weight of a truth that could not be ignored without consequence. The castle, rising in the growing light, seemed at first unchanged, its towers quiet, its windows dim, as though the events of the night had belonged to some other world entirely. Yet Hagrid knew better, because what had been uncovered beneath the forest did not remain confined to hidden chambers and secret tunnels, and though the creatures had been freed and the operation disrupted, the mind behind it had slipped away, carrying with it knowledge, connections, and the dangerous confidence of one who believed himself shielded by something stronger than simple concealment. Fang trotted close beside him, still weary, still uncertain, yet unwilling to fall behind, and as they approached the familiar outline of Hagrid's hut, the boarhound gave a low, relieved whine, as though the sight of home itself might banish the memory of iron cages and unnatural light. Though Hagrid did not pause there, not even to rest or gather himself, because he understood with perfect clarity that delay, even of the smallest kind, would serve only those who had already proven themselves adept at turning time into an advantage. Instead, he continued upward toward the castle doors, his pace unbroken, his expression set, and though the grounds were empty at that early hour, the weight of his passage seemed to carry with it a quiet urgency that would not go unnoticed for long. It was Professor Minerva McGonagall who met him in the entrance hall, already robed, already alert, as though some instinct or unseen thread had drawn her from her quarters before the first student had even stirred. And though her face remained composed, there was a sharpness in her eyes that told Hagrid she understood immediately that this was no ordinary report. "Hagrid," she said, her voice firm yet not unkind, "what has happened?" Hagrid did not waste words. "Trouble in the forest," he replied, holding out the bundle of parchments and the brass tag marked with the strange symbol, his tone steady despite the storm of anger that still lingered beneath it. "Not just poachers, Professor. Something bigger, something organized, and I reckon it's been going on longer than anyone's realized." Professor McGonagall took the items from him, her gaze moving swiftly across the documents, the seals, the markings, and as she read, the lines of her face tightened ever so slightly, not in panic, but in the controlled recognition of a problem that demanded immediate and decisive action. "These are ministry documents," she said quietly. "Aye," Hagrid answered, "and that's the worst of it." She looked up. "Explain." And so he did. Not in fragments, not in uncertain guesses, but in a clear and detailed account of everything he had seen, from the disturbed clearing and the trapped thestral, to the hidden passage, the holding chambers, the ledgers, the names, and finally the confrontation with Caro himself, whose identity he did not hesitate to name, because there was no longer any value in silence where truth was required. Professor McGonagall listened without interruption, her attention absolute, and though she asked a question here and there for clarity, she did not doubt the substance of what she heard, for Hagrid's account carried the weight of lived experience, not speculation, and the evidence in her hands supported it fully. When he finished, there was a moment of stillness. Then she drew a slow breath. "This is grave," she said, and though her voice remained steady, there was no mistaking the seriousness of her words. "If what you have uncovered is accurate, then this extends beyond a simple breach of law. It suggests corruption at a level that cannot be addressed through ordinary channels alone." "That's what I thought," Hagrid said, "which is why I came straight here." "You did the right thing," she replied. For a moment, she considered. Then, with a decisiveness that Hagrid had always admired in her, she turned toward the inner corridors of the castle. "We will not act rashly," she said, "but neither will we delay. These documents will be secured, copies will be made, and a report will be prepared for those within the ministry whom I trust to act with integrity. At the same time, we will increase supervision of the forest and ensure that no further incursions occur unnoticed." Hagrid nodded. "And Caro?" he asked. Professor McGonagall's expression hardened slightly. "If he is indeed involved, then he will not remain hidden indefinitely," she said. "Men who rely upon secrecy often underestimate how fragile it becomes once exposed." Though Hagrid allowed himself a small, grim nod. "Good," he said. Outside, the light had grown stronger, the sun beginning to rise fully over the horizon, casting warmth across the grounds that had, only hours before, been the stage for something far darker. And though the forest still stood as it always had, silent and watchful, there was now a difference, subtle but real, as though the balance within it had shifted back toward something closer to its natural state. In the days that followed, changes came quickly. The forest was watched more closely than ever before, not only by Hagrid, but by those who understood its rhythms and its dangers, and though no further attempts were made to breach its hidden paths, the knowledge of what had nearly been lost lingered in every careful patrol and every quiet observation. Within the ministry, inquiries began, quiet at first, then widening as the evidence made its way through trusted hands, and though names were spoken cautiously and accusations weighed with care, the structure that had allowed Caro's operation to exist began, piece by piece, to unravel under scrutiny. Caro himself did not reappear. Not immediately. But his absence did not protect him as he might have hoped, for the network he had built could not sustain itself without its central figure, and as its connections were traced and its protections examined, it became clear that his escape had not been the end of the matter, but merely a delay. For Hagrid, the resolution came not in a courtroom or a report, but in the forest itself. Days after the confrontation, as he walked once more along the edge of the trees, checking the grounds as he always had, he heard a familiar sound, faint but unmistakable. The soft rattling breath of a thestral moving quietly through the undergrowth. And when he turned, he saw it, the young creature he had freed, now standing stronger, its wings whole, its gaze calm. It watched him for a moment. Then, with a single graceful motion, it turned and disappeared into the deeper forest, not in fear, but in belonging. Hagrid smiled, just slightly. Stay safe, he muttered. And though the world beyond the forest would continue to hold its share of darkness, of schemes and hidden dangers, and men who mistook control for care, the creatures within it, for now, were free. The conflict had been met. The truth had been uncovered. And though not every thread had been tied neatly, the outcome was clear. The harm stopped, the path forward secured. For Hagrid, that was enough.
Ну що, тут йшла мова про порятунок істот, але помилка містера Крео, людина, яка переконала себе, що благородні слова можуть виправдати неправильні вчинки. Він говорив про захист, про порятунок, про збереження магічних створінь, але за красивим поясненням ховалося просте бажання контролювати і використовувати живих істот для власної вигоди. Здається, що це дуже важливий урок і для нашого світу. Іноді найбільші помилки починаються не з відвертого зла, а з моменту, коли людина знаходиться для себе зручне виправдання. Коли ми починаємо пояснювати собі, чому можна переступити через чужу свободу, через совість, через те, що відчуваємо в правильному серці. Історія Гагріда нагадує нам, що для доброї справи потрібно робити недобрі речі, то варто дуже уважно подивитися, чи справді ця справа добра. Мабуть, саме тому так важливо час від часу чесно запитувати себе не лише про те, чого ми хочемо досягти, а й про те, ким ми стаємо на цьому шляху. Бо неправильне рішення рідко руйнує все одразу. Воно починається з маленького самообману, і саме його варто боятися найбільше. Так що так, друзі, до зустрічі.